John O'Dowd is with me now. Minister, thanks for joining us on the programme. Schools are going to close. That seems to be inevitable. Is the money you'll save worth the disruption it'll cause to the thousands of parents and children who will be affected?
Well, contrary to the views of the Professor and indeed that question, this is not an economic question. This is an education question. I have never set this formula forward as being about saving money. Well, in one sense, over the overall education budget, it's about using our money more effectively, more efficiently.
Yeah, you do have to save money.
But no, not in these circumstances. I have never said area planning is about saving money. It is about saving young people's educational outcomes. That's the importance of this debate.
Right. So are you telling me that if you didn't have to save money in your budget, you'd still be closing these schools?
Yes. And it's a fixed or a set question with an answer. This is not simply about closing schools. This is about looking at the schools estate going into 10, 15, 20 years into the future, ensuring that we have a sustainable schools estate, that we use our resources wisely, but that we have educational outcomes that meets the needs of our communities. Currently we have an estate which is planned on the basis of individual schools. What I'm arguing is, and I think the argument is broadly accepted, we may differ in how we go about it, but what I'm arguing is that we need to plan our education system on the needs of the education system which delivers good education.
Okay, well, Professor Vani Barua says there that you'll save £35 million in theory, even if we set aside the saving which may or may not come, because he also goes on to say, Mervyn Story, for example, the DEP says, could be eroded with other costs, additional transport costs, redundancy payments and so forth. There's still going to be major disruption to 50,000 children potentially. Is it worth it? Is this shake-up worth it?
It's not an economic question, it's an education question. And yes, it is worth it if you put it in those contexts. We have to assure ourselves that our schools estate is capable of delivering a 21st education system to the young people it serves. That's what this is about. There is a formula there. There's sustainable schools policy, and the media, maybe understandably, have concentrated on one element of it, the number in the schools, rather than looking at the 6 criteria upon which a school will be judged. And then I will make a final judgment on it based on the evidence coming forward from local communities. And each school will tell its own story. Each community will tell its own story, and I will base my judgments upon them. But at the core of that judgment will be, what are the educational outcomes for the young people going to be?
And are the numbers right? Because it's 105 minimum pupils for a rural school, 140 for an urban school. When George Bain, Professor Sir George Bain, did his report a number of years ago, he said that schools were sustainable with 84. That would be 7 classes of 12 pupils.
Again, it's not a numbers game, and that's one of 6 criteria. And one of the criteria, particularly in terms of rural communities, is its links with the communities, educational outcomes. Yes, the financial balance of the school is also taken into account, but this is not solely a numbers game. You can't tell the quality of education coming out of a school or the potential for quality of education in generations to come simply by looking at a spreadsheet. That is not how this will be judged.
Of course, especially if you look at the rural network of schools. There have been small schools, part of the landscape here in this part of the country for generations. They managed to continue for generations, and I think a lot of people now wonder why that has changed. What is your answer to them?
Well, I'm very conscious of the needs for schools within rural communities, and that's why I say each school will tell its own story, and each community will tell its own story, and that's not why I'm judging the future of any school based on the numbers game which is out there in the media. The media have become fixated on the numbers game. I'm not fixated on the numbers game. I will look at each school on its merits, and we're at the start of a conversation, a consultation has started out there. Communities and schools will come forward and say, this is our plan for this school. I will judge that plan against the educational outcomes and the needs for the community. But you also, in terms of rural communities, you have to look at that as well in terms of what role does this school play in the rural community? What part of the core is this school in the rural community? How does it help sustain a rural community? And there's isolated communities out there as well from both sections of the broader community, which the school is a central focus on, and I also have to take that into account.
Okay, well, we'll pick up on that point specifically with a representative of the Ulster Farmers Union in just a moment. Are you saying, though, just to go back to what you said a moment or two ago, you are persuadable? If it's not just a numbers game, this is a consultation process, we all know that. You're persuadable if schools put forward very strong cases, even if the numbers don't look good?
Yes, I'm open to persuasion on all these matters because, as I say, a story coming out of rural Fermanagh will be different than a story coming out of urban West or North Belfast. There will be a completely different story there, and it has to be taken into account. So the media, as I say, have focused on the numbers game, maybe understandably. I'm not focused on the numbers game. I'm focused on the educational well-being of the young people and the future young people these schools serve.
Yeah, I don't think it's just the media with respect that are fixated on the numbers game. I think the schools and the parents and the pupils are also pretty fixated on the numbers game because they've been told that's an important criterion on which they will be judged.
Well, if I can offer reassurance to the communities there who are judging the future of their schools on that, that is not my fixation. My fixation is on the quality of education for the young people in that school. Numbers is one of 6 broader criteria which I would make a judgment against, but the evidence coming forward from the schools, an educational plan coming forward from the schools and communities will be taken into account before I make any decision.
Okay, and you accept, do you, that this is going to be a difficult process for everybody involved? I mean, for the teachers, for the support staff, they face the possibility of losing their jobs or being redeployed. For parents, they face a much more difficult process of getting kids to school in the future.
Well, the core function of a school is to provide quality education. That's the core function of a school. And if we do not get that right, then I think it's going to be a much more difficult conversation in years to come if we let down a generation or future generations of young people because we do not have a sustainable schools estate going forward in the future. But I emphasise again, we're at the start of the conversation, not at the end of the conversation.
Okay, all right. Minister, for now, thank you very much indeed. Stay with us because joining us to discuss this, the Deputy President of the Ulster Farmers Union, Barclay Bell, Jim Clark, Chief Executive of the Council for Catholic Maintained Schools, and Betty Orr, who's a retired primary school principal. Betty Orr, just let me ask you first of all, you're sitting alongside the Minister, you've heard what he had to say this morning. Are you reassured at all by anything we've heard so far?
I'm very reassured that he is saying that he's putting the needs of the children first. And funnily enough, it's the first time I've maybe heard it. I've been through this process 3 or 4 times. I was made redundant and I had to go to another school. Subsequently, the school I had left, it was closed. All the pupils came up, so I knew them all when they came back up to where I was. Then when I was a vice principal in South Belfast, that school was closed. So I have been through this process. It's very emotional for everybody involved. Obviously teachers, principals, the support staff, they're all professional and they will go wherever they are sent, if it's in an amalgamation or if it's in a closure. And what is actually usually very good about that is that the staff go with the children. So they're not in isolation. It's not like you move house. The children know the staff and they move together, and quite often too all the staff are retained, which gives good pupil-teacher ratio and smaller classes and less composite classes, which a lot of parents like. And I think if it is done in a way, with good consultation, but with the needs of the children, not just their education needs, their emotional needs, then the process can actually work quite well. And it's amazing how resilient children are and how well they can fit into a new school. Because they have to do it, let's face it. At secondary level, they move into this huge school and it takes a while to settle. But I have found with primary children, they seem to settle in very quickly.
Okay, well let's hear from Barclay Bell. You've got clear reservations. You've issued a statement to that effect. You're very concerned that children going to rural schools could lose out in the shake-up. Are you reassured by what you've heard this morning?
I suppose, listening to the Minister here this morning, yes, it is somewhat reassuring to hear him say it is not totally based on a numbers game. Closure of rural schools very much eats at the heart of rural communities, and that is our big fear, that rural communities at the minute are being decimated. Not only do we see school closures, we have banks, we have all businesses closing in rural communities, and the whole heart of the rural communities is being eaten at.
But the Minister's point is that children who go to rural schools deserve a good quality education, just as kids who go to city schools deserve a good education. They're not necessarily getting that in the current network of schools available to them.
Well, it's possibly, when you look at some of the results from some of these small rural schools, I mean, they will rank up with any of these bigger schools.
Well, some of them do and some of them don't.
Some of them do and some of them don't. But, as well as that, I suppose recently when our Minister of Agriculture released her rural paper, her white paper on rural communities, I mean, really in that it was to try and protect rural communities and keep the quality of life in the countryside as good as anywhere else. And this is what we are concerned.
And you, just go to Jim Clark in a second, you, Minister, have made a statement in response to what Barclay actually said before the weekend, saying that is something that will be taken on board.
Yeah, I welcome the voice of the Ulster Farmers Union in this debate, and indeed others from the rural sector who have come out and spoken on this matter, because it shows once again that there's a strong community feeling within rural communities. But I think we all accept the point, and you made the point that I've already said, rural communities deserve good education as well. And yes, there will be examples of where there is very small rural primary schools that can continue to provide good education because they have to, because you cannot amalgamate them with a nearby school, or because of the travel distance involved for the young children involved. It's unacceptable for them to travel the further distance to another school. But I emphasise again, if communities coming forward to me with an educational plan, I take into account. And I also want to emphasise as well, the Agricultural Minister has spoken to me about the needs of rural communities in relation to schools, etc. And I will continue to have that conversation with her.
All right. Let's hear from Jim Clark. Is this a blueprint for better education delivery across Northern Ireland in the future, or are there issues that you think still need to be more carefully thought through?
Well, it's one of the strands. I think the key here is about children. One of the things that we in CCMS would say is, particularly when a school comes just to defend itself, that our priority is with the children. How can children within a community access the best possible education? So the focus on children is very important here. There is a correlation, however, between the number of pupils and the resource that the school can generate. And Barclay refers to some rural schools that produce very good outcomes. They do, but the cost per head of the pupils in those schools is much greater than the cost per head of schools, for instance, in urban areas. So we need to balance that as well.
What about the wider issue of the challenges that will be faced, for example, in your sector, of the idea of consolidated schools, shared schools, the whole drive in some areas, presumably, towards integrated schools? I mean, that could have a very big impact on you.
Well, we're very open to this. We are responsive to communities, and we would argue that a school is very much part of a community, but the community must play its part in the school. And the evidence is that we only see some of that when there's a threat to a school. It would be much better to see that as an integral part of defending a rural community, so that the school does attract the people in the area. Because many people actually pass by schools to attend, some cases a rural school, some cases a school elsewhere. So the concept of communities and schools are very close to us. The notion of a community risking the loss of two schools, I think, is an issue that the community has to respond to, and we will be positive in listening to the community's view on that.
Okay, Betty, just to come back to you, I mean, I think I'm right in saying most of your experience was in city schools rather than in rural schools. What about this whole notion of a move towards sharing facilities, or indeed amalgamation, particularly if it's cross-sectoral? Is that workable in a place like Belfast, in your view?
It's probably more difficult, but some of the schools have actually become integrated schools, and they've changed their status basically to keep the school and to hold that community together.
And that has worked in those circumstances?
That certainly has worked. This is not new. When I first took up post in '93 in Belfast, in '94 there was an area plan. The boards of governors, the principals were consulted, and at that point we thought that there was an amalgamation on the way. Later on, I think again it reared its head in 2000, and these plans have been around for a long, long time. Okay,
but Minister, can I just ask you about the difficulties? There would be difficulties, and Betty has hinted at it there. Perhaps in parts of Belfast it would be quite a challenge to actually integrate schools, or make schools, or encourage schools to share their facilities, or indeed even to amalgamate, particularly across the sectors. How realistic is that, do you think, as part of this plan?
I think in some of the urban settings it may be more difficult, but I'm talking to a number of rural communities who have plans about very radical amalgamations of their schools coming under new titles, in fact, who have also suffered as a result of the conflict, who are prepared to test each other out and work together with each other to bring forward new plans for schools. And I'm very encouraged by those conversations, and I think that is a good thing. I just want to touch on some of the opening remarks by Betty. Betty has been through this process, from one closed school to another closed school, and she's right, it was never planned properly. These were closures almost by accident. They knocked into each other. Instead of having a plan for an area where we know if a school has to close, that those children will transfer to a sustainable school, which will be sustainable for a generation going forward.
Does that reassure you, Barclay Bell, to hear that this will be, whatever happens, at least, according to the Minister, it's going to be properly planned? So people, particularly in rural areas, could afford to be reassured by that, perhaps.
I think it is very reassuring to hear the Minister say that, and certainly we would be certainly recommending looking at shared education, and but our chief priority is that children in the rural areas have equal treatment.
Are you happy with that? That the planning, at least now, it may be difficult, there may be all sorts of awkward conversations to be had in the years ahead, but at least the conversation is happening.
Absolutely.
And the Minister says he's listening.
And we're part of that conversation. But if we try to push that, we risk a community losing its sense of direction here. We've got to have the community state its voice and its preference. But we're certainly open to the concept of schools working together into the future.
Okay, Minister, when is it all going to be done and dusted? When, finally, are you going to be able to say, right, that's completed, we've moved on, we've got the schools estate we now need, and we can deal with other problems?
This consultation lasts until June of this year, and then they'll have time for reflection, etc. So I hope to make an announcement towards the end of this year, a more firmed up announcement. But the key to this is to keep them driving it forward, because we don't want to go back to the situation Betty referred to, that 10 years ago this was talked about and wasn't completed, and 20 years ago this wasn't completed. I'm determined to drive this process forward, and I think, in fairness to the broader community and indeed to representatives, that people recognise the need to do this. We don't always agree on how to do it, but they recognise the need to do it.
Okay, we'll leave it there for now.